The session this morning will be in 3 parts. First, Tanya will give us an introduction of about 15 minutes. Then we'll go out in breakout rooms in groups of 3 or 4, and then we will come back together for some general discussion and questions. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to begin with acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. Let us pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and become aware of the ancient land surrounding and supporting us, its history, its presence and its future that is so deeply intertwined with ours. I'm very excited to welcome Tanya Wittwer. Tanya is a lecturer in Pastoral Theology at the Adelaide College of Leadership and Theology at the Adelaide College of Divinity, Theology, Flinders University in Adelaide. And she recently published a paper called Pastoral Considerations for a Pandemic. And she will reflect with us on the pastoral challenges that are facing us now and after lockdown. And yes, hoping to reflect on strategies, on things that we might be able to do, patterns, how these things work, all of these things. So we're very, very happy and pleased to have her. Yes, I'm looking forward to this. Thank you. Can I hand over to you, Tanya?
Sure. I'm coming to you from the land of the Paramount people in the Adelaide Hills. I have a very broad and shallow CV, and quite a lot of the time has been spent as a, excuse me, I just have to change my view to gallery view so I don't keep looking at myself. That's too off-putting. A lot of my working life has been spent at the intersection of the church and social services, and more recently a fair bit in public health. And in 1999 and 2000, I was on the Australian Pandemic Planning Committee. Yes, there was such a thing. The World Health Organization had looked ahead and said, you know, we're about due for another pandemic and really everyone needs to start planning, and come up with a whole list of things that had to be considered. And so when COVID-19, which wasn't called that at the time, started emerging, instead of being terrified, I'm afraid I have to confess to being a little bit excited. Oh, you know, this is happening. Are we ready? But I'm sorry for that. I seek your absolution. But I'm far from an expert in the area of crises. As I look around this room, this extended room, I can see an awful lot of wisdom. I can see there's a lot of experience here gathered. And so the time that you're going to spend together in the breakout rooms is not just, you know, to pretend that we think you've got something to say. It's because it seems to me that if we can get our heads together, we can find a whole lot of things that remind each other of that will be helpful as we come out of the lockdown part of the pandemic. But just going back to some basic things that I had in the article, I'm not going to go through all the content. You got the link to the article. You can read it yourself if you haven't already. But Duncan, just stick that first graph up first, please. As I was thinking about the pandemic and faith communities, it seemed to me that we were going through what is known as collective trauma. Now, in Australia, we've been really protected from the worst of it. and yet there has been the threat to lives. There has been loss of life. There has been, and will be for a long time, significant loss of security, financial resources. You know, there's a lot of families who are really doing it tough, and it has an impact on all of us, even on those of our congregations that are quite protected from it because people are on fixed incomes, you know, or they're no longer in the workplace and affected by unemployment and things like that. And we know a lot about collective trauma. Those of you that have done training in disaster recovery know a lot about recovery from collective trauma. I tried to think through what I knew about disasters and collective trauma and plot it onto a graph of a sort of illustrating a trajectory of healing. And I know it looks a bit crazy, but you know, we start off in the time where we're alert. It seems like something might be happening. There's a bit of a threat, and then it hits us, and morale, emotional well-being goes down while we're in the midst of whatever the crisis is that's happening. But then comes up again as things start to open up, and we go through a phase that we think of as the heroic phase, where we managed this together, we got through this, everything's great, let's open the church, everything's going to be wonderful. But then what tends to happen is that there's a period of disillusionment and grief that brings morale and emotional well-being in groups down a lot further than actually happened during the initial impact. In that first time of getting together after something really awful has happened, people can want to start planning things straight away and jump into doing new initiatives, using the energy they have of being together. But anything that started at that phase is really unlikely to continue. It's likely to be unsustainable because people are fatigued and because cracks will start to show. You know, there's this sense when you're going through something that we're all in this together. We're united in this, we're supporting each other well. But then once the initial threat's gone, a whole variety of things start having an impact to drive wedges in communities. And so as leaders, we need to be really aware of this and being very careful with our communities and to help them traverse this time. And we do have the experience that we need to be able to do this well. But I'll just pause before I move on with that thought and move on to the next slide, please, Duncan, which is key principles for enhancing individual and community mental health, emotional health, spiritual health in the immediate to midterm. This is not rocket science. This is actually epidemiology. No, it's public health, probably. It's stuff that you know, promoting a sense of safety, promoting a sense of calm, a sense of self and collective efficacy, connectedness and hope. When I say you know it, it's because I've seen leaders do this. I've seen the way that people jumped in to provide worship experiences, to provide ways to keep congregations connected, that they're paying attention to these things even without knowing it. This list was drawn up by an international collective of experts in disaster recovery. And so it's just been an absolute delight for me to see how people have been doing these things instinctively out of their own pastoral heart. And then there's a plus and one more click, Duncan, and we get one additional thing I add to it, which is self-care. But leaders are in this for the long haul. It's the longest marathon you've ever run. And so self-care, the things that you know that work well for you are the things that you need to make sure, even now as things are opening up, that you are keeping in place. Make sure you're taking your time off. Make sure you're feeding yourself well. You're going to the places that feed your soul. You're doing the things that nurture you spiritually and emotionally. You're spending time with the people that are life-giving for you. I think we can probably unshare again, Duncan. Go back to faces. And it seems to me that we have already, well, in South Australia certainly, there's a bit of a sense now that things are starting to open up. And I'm starting to see something of a little bit of euphoria in some groups as they're feeling like they can get on with stuff, but I'm also starting to see the other side. In a class just the other day, I was asking the group how they were feeling at the moment and how they felt their faith community were tracking. And there was a huge variety of responses. Some people were saying, you know, they're feeling quite excited. Others were saying, yeah, it's a confusing time. Others were saying, oh, my youth group actually feels like it's falling apart at the moment. We've gone really well till now, but it just something's feeling different. People were talking about impatience and intolerance. And then one of the sages in the group, for those of you who know Trevor Phillips, said, you know, I've heard all this before. And I know that Trevor had been in Arnhem Land when a cyclone came through. I knew, you know, there were other places where he'd been at times of natural disasters or things, and I thought he was going to talk about that. But no, what he said was, I've heard all this before. When I'm sitting down with a group of people who have experienced a cultural shift as they're going into a new place to start mission, this is the stuff I hear from them. And it gave me a new way to think about this transition period, that we as faith communities are in a new space, a new context, and going through a cultural shift. And so the confusion, the misunderstandings, that funny place of where the familiar is suddenly unfamiliar and where things that we would have assumed might feel strange are actually feeling comfortable. That's about cultural shift. So here we are missionaries in this new place that we're ready to explore. And we need to be kind to ourselves and to those around us. And just like missionaries going into any new culture, the key thing that we need to be doing now is listening, listening and listening. Rather than coming up with ideas on how your communities can benefit at this time, I'm hoping that we can together generate a whole lot more ideas than will ever come out of my head. And so you are going to be broken up into breakout rooms, but here is what I want from you in the breakout room.
Yes, so what can you think of from your experience that could assist your congregation with grieving and cultural shift that might resource you for the coming months?
I'm understanding that each of you have experience in working with grief, and that each of you also have experience in cultural shift. There's a cultural shift just going from one congregation to another. So you have a lot of experience to draw on. And some of you have experience in working with communities after disasters. And so out of that experience, what things can you bring into this arena to share with others as ideas to help congregations get through what's likely to be the tough time over the next while? And when we do come back again from the breakout rooms, I'm going to invite people to share something briefly, because we're a big group and not a lot of time, something that they heard someone else say that really had an impact on them. So I don't want to hear something that you thought of yourself. I want to hear what you heard in the breakout room. Okay?
All right, welcome back everybody. We're all back in the same room again. Good to see you made it. And back to you, Tanya.
Okay, so I set you the task of drawing from your own experience to come up with ideas of how to assist the community through the tough time, the grieving time. Did you hear anything that really struck you? Anything that you thought, yes, this is what I needed to hear today? Put your hand up, Duncan. You're going to have to help me in identifying people to speak.
Yeah.
And we probably need to mute all the
microphones.
microphones.
That's right, yes. Yeah. So, mute all. There we go. Okay, Ian Stewart. Yep.
Thanks, Duncan. We sort of were having a good little chat and a listen, and suddenly ran out of time. But I was thinking that all of us, well, the three who were speaking, I guess, four who were speaking, we're talking about the way the people are working together, and they seem to each have a similar system where they have leaders or link people or whatever who each have responsibility for a number of people in the congregation, whom they contact by telephone, and that can of course become a two-way thing, with the phone call being initiated by the link person or by the person who's under their care. And I was thinking to myself as they were talking about that, that's a really great way to ensure that everybody's being cared for, at least being monitored to a certain extent to see how they're travelling. And it seemed to me that would be a pretty good model to continue into the time ahead of us when we're trying to work out how or if we get back together. I know in our own situation we're thinking, well, should we be continuing some of the online stuff once we get back together in a congregational situation? Because some who know the congregation have noted that with the Zoom, they're seeing faces that they haven't seen in church for a while. And I know we've got one dear lady who's in Ballarat, and she says it's fantastic. It's lovely to be able to see all her friends on Zoom every week. So she's really enjoying it.
There's two things, Ian, that I take out of what you've said. One is the paying attention to the connectedness, to the care for individuals. Most of our communities have set up some kind of pastoral care scheme that's worked while we've been in relative lockdown. And because situations will be changing, that scheme just may not work anymore. And similarly, whatever we were doing before we struck COVID-19 is unlikely to work as well as we need it to now. So we need to keep flexible. We need to keep listening. We need to keep trying things. And so, you know, the idea you thought of there is something that, yeah, give it a go, see if it works, but keep watching to see if perhaps it needs some adjusting at the edges. And then, yeah, a lot of congregations have had the same experience. People who were finding it hard to walk through the door, either because they'd moved away or something had happened in their life, you know, they couldn't bear going into the church because they just saw their husband's coffin out the front, you know, when they walk through the door. So much easier to come online with Zoom. How are we going to use what we've learned to go ahead? Is it realistic to think that we can keep an online presence as well as doing face-to-face? Yeah. Okay, someone else telling me something they heard.
Paul Curtin.
Well, something I heard from, I think the four of us who were speaking all shared something of other traumas that this one comes on top of. Collectively for Australia, the bushfires, we were all in a state of loss and grief. Even if we hadn't personally experienced it, it was in our living rooms every day for months. And we hadn't come out of that at all. And the pandemic hit. So we've got that underlying grief and loss and this on top of it. And I was very pleased to see the graph that Tanya shared with us, because it explained some of my own feelings and the feelings that I'm seeing around with others. So that's been, in that discussion has all been extremely helpful. I'm sorry I didn't really come up with a solution to solving the problem, but sometimes the first step is to better understand what's going on with ourselves and others around us as the next step. And the question's very important. So I'm certainly going to be asking that with more of our leaders to make sure we are all aware of that issue a lot stronger, because there was this sense of in the community that we're through it. And I had this great doubt. I thought, no, we can't possibly be through it. This is worse than things we've seen in the past. And this has been extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. The two things that I heard most clearly in what you said, Paul, a reminder of the context that we're in. And in every time there is collective trauma, there are always going to have been people who were already in a stage of grief, of really struggling with things before the trauma hit. And in this one, certainly the bushfires from much of Australia was the context that the pandemic came on top of. And so the types of things we were doing for recovery after the bushfire were really interrupted. The relationships that were being formed, the kind of help that was being offered just got wiped out by the lockdown. And then you mentioned the graph and how that was helpful for sort of trying to understand yourself, and which is helpful to remind me that one of the things that I say about, something like that graph of a potential trajectory of healing, it's not a descriptive thing. It's a visual aid that might help some people think about where they are and where to go to next, and the kind of resourcing that will be needed. Yeah. Okay, someone else.
Damien just got his hand up.
Yes, I did. Couple of things that came up from the topics that Tanya had been talking about. A positive cultural shift that some of us have noticed is that Zoom has been really helpful for lots of people. I mean, that was probably something new that people had never done before. But being able to Zoom into meetings or do online worship has been a helpful cultural shift. Also in terms of grieving, yes, we've spoken about missing face-to-face contact, so Zoom has been helpful for that. One thing that I learned is the experience that we've had here at Conniva in the far west of Victoria has been the inability to cross the border into South Australia, which is only 25k from here, and people are isolated from their families who are 25 kilometres away, but there's that poisonous line on the road that we can't cross. We can't shop, we can't go to the bank, we can't do those sorts of things in Bordertown, which is our big town. But there's the opposite sort of grieving, which which Greg from Dandenong mentioned, are international students who are stuck in Australia. So it's not so much the people who can't go or are missing their family in that way. It's the people who are stuck in Australia and are missing their family, and the blessing that the church has been to step up for that, to be providing food, be providing company and that kind of stuff, and working in a very different experience of isolation than what we've got over here. So that was interesting for me to hear, that even with the visits that I've been doing as a pastor, more home visits, which we've talked about in groups, more people accessing church through either the type service that we do or our Facebook. We've actually got people who are stuck and grieving that they can't go home. Rather than being stuck in their own home, they're stuck away from home. And that's a very different situation to what we had first thought of here.
And some of the things that come to mind for me as I'm listening to you, Damien, is the unique pastoral situations that will gradually be coming to the surface. Some of the things that I name in the article were things like the people who got caught in online porn. They were home, the computer was there, getting stuck in things that they hadn't previously had such an impact on them, and how this will start to show in relationships and making cracks in relationships. The people, domestic violence, people trapped with the person who is abusing them, and what that will do to the kids. People who haven't been able to fly home to Italy to go to the funeral of their mother. Just so many different things where we have a lot of shared grief, but it's all going to feel different and look different, and people are going to feel as if, no, you don't understand, your grief is not like mine. And so listening. I saw another hand up.
Yeah, there's two. Heather Sperling was first, and then David Hyam, and I think that will then be it. We've got 7 minutes, so
okay.
Yes, Heather first.
Thank you. I've found that already people have different views of coming out, in that some people already are not worrying about social distancing, and others are still very, very aware of it. And so, whereas previously I felt we were a cohesive congregation, I think that when we do gradually come back together, we're going to be all at different places, and that's going to be something we need to be aware of when coming back together, that we can't assume that we're all in the same spot, and that's something that we're going to have to be aware of.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. Everyone, we can't assume that we know how anyone is feeling and how anyone is behaving. And as far as the social distancing thing goes, we're going to have to, those who are in leadership are going to have to be very clear about what the behaviour is that's going to be happening when we do meet in churches. I suppose with my public health background, I've been really aware of the need to keep up the social distancing, to keep up the good hand and cough hygiene and things like that. And I was just appalled when a lay preacher in my husband's church said that he was coming round to watch the Zoom worship with my husband in his study. And I did not want that at all. We're not in the high risk category, but we are old enough to be in a risk category, as is the gentleman who was doing this. And I was thinking, if he'd been in touch with COVID-19, he would be a super spreader, because he was doing this through the church, thinking this was a good thing to be going into people's homes. And that was when things were only really just opening up. So it's not only being clear about communication about what's happening with us as a community, it's also being very aware of others and knowing how to, or being sensitive enough to know that some people are just going to move in for the hug, and you'd have to be ready to work out how you're going to respond to that, and that others are going to be actually much more careful than perhaps you've been aware of, and so needing to have your antennae up. Now, there was one last person, and then I'll finish with a couple minutes of summary.
Okay, it was really almost a similar point to what's already been raised, but it was brought up in our group that people in our own community will be joyful, perhaps that Australia has not been as seriously affected as others, and that we'll be coming out of lockdown and we'll be able to worship together and get together. But some individuals' hearts and minds will be with communities and families, friends who are overseas. Yeah. And they'll still be in trauma and shock and anxiety and worry about their close friends, family, communities that they've left behind. So while there's joy going on, there'll also be great sadness still continuing. And the need to be aware of those individuals and be able to pay attention to those individuals.
Yeah. And until there is a vaccine, if there is going to be a vaccine, and until we really know how to treat COVID-19, there is no end even for Australia. You know, as long as international borders are closed, there are a lot of people who are going to continue to be impacted here, even if they don't have the concern for family and friends overseas. Plus, it will continue to come to us to the TV. You know, it's only just started in the refugee camps, for example, and it's just going to be terrible there. Okay, a few final points. We are people of the story, and within the story, there are plenty of resources that we can use at this time. Collective trauma almost shaped the Judeo-Christian tradition. We had the exile, we had the death of the leader, we had a young church emerging in a society of great oppression. And so within Scripture, we have a lot of resources to help through times of collective trauma. We are people of the story, and we add our own stories to that. In our own congregations, we have a lot of experience, and we have people who understand what it is to go through trauma in a community. And so we'll call on those people. A really key point in terms of recovering from collective trauma is collaboration, working together. People, bringing people together rather than imposing things from the top. Collaboration, listening carefully, helping people to find what their role is in this new thing, and being prepared to walk together into what is God doing with us at this time? What is God calling us to do beyond this time? 10:29, back to you, Anneke.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your article and this presentation this morning. It's been amazing and very, well, I can only speak for myself, but inspiring, enlightening, a blessing. It's great. And I would love to have another hour, but we don't have another hour. And I think, yeah, there's a lot I've heard that I'll take with me that have given me some things to think about, some things to work with, some things to ponder, and it's just been fantastic. So thank you for making yourself available. And also thank you everyone who's come this morning and contributed and been part of our breakout rooms. And if my breakout room was anything to go by. We will, well, we've just said in the private chat that we will continue the conversation. So those 10, it won't be just those 10 minutes, there will be more. And I've wondered if we can, just to finish, just take a moment, and I don't know if you want to close your eyes or not, but just take a moment to let all that settle everything that you've heard, everything that's come up, not trying to hold on to anything, but just allowing it to be what it is. And then perhaps in prayer, and again, that will be different for every one of us, just in your own way. Bring the world into your mind, everything that's happening at the moment, that's impacting on us, but also the things that we may not even know about. And then perhaps bring your community to mind, that's moving into the next phase of opening up, perhaps, where there may be discussions, where there may be worries, concerns about people, things that need to happen. Think about those people in the room now, here now with you, that have been here this morning for this hour. And let's pray for each other as we go out into the world, that we will be able to use what we've heard, the thoughts and insights that we've gained. And then last but not least, perhaps bring ourselves to God, and whatever it is that is uppermost in our minds and deep down in our emotions stirring. And then I'd like to pray for Tanya and her work, the beautiful words, the beautiful article, and all the things that she'll be able to do in this time. May God bless us as we go, and may hope, unity and faith be uppermost as we venture into the next phase of our journey as people and as a church together. Amen. Blessings, everyone. I hope you have a good day and a good weekend, and we might see each other again sometime.
That'd be good.